How you doing? So today we're gonna jump right into it. We're gonna talk about several things. We're gonna talk about 1099 DAs. It's coming up for those that hold cryptocurrencies, which in my opinion, it's gonna create a nightmare. But we'll get to that. And then Trump floated a very interesting point during one of his speeches that I want to kind of go over, which will, I mean, it may simplify things if this happens, but we'll see first if he gets elected, um, and then if it actually gets implemented, because those are two mountains to climb. That anything with the tax code, unless it benefits somebody, within that little structure, it's very hard to actually get done. So we'll see. But so we're gonna start with the 1099 DA. So this is a form that crypto exchanges. Oh, we're gonna go over that too. This is a form that crypto exchanges are going to have to give to the people that hold cryptocurrencies, and then you're going to have to report it on your taxes. And then, yeah, so they get it's kind of like the same thing with every other form, right? The IRS gets the same form, you get the form, and then you have to file whatever paperwork you have to file associated with that form. It is what it is. That's kind of our tax code right now. But let me pull up um, the sample 1099 DA that they published out in draft form, so we can kind of take a look at it, and then we'll go from there. Let's see here. So we're going to actually download it so we can view it in PDF format instead. So we're going to go here. Okay, here we go. All right, perfect. So now we're gonna go. All right. So this is and let me actually start um, the TikTok live. I haven't done that. 1099 NBA. Okay. We're gonna do okay. So now we're live on TikTok, and yep, you can hear me, you can see it. Okay. So on TikTok, it may be a little bit difficult to actually see. On YouTube and the other platforms will probably be a little bit easier. But basically, this form, the 1099 DA, they're planning on starting to issue this for this year, this next coming year. They released this draft August 29th. And again, it's going to be based on a bunch of other stuff, right? They're not saying to file it now because it's in draft form, it's not ready yet. And we can go over the process on how that happens on a later video. But here's pretty much the form that they're planning on issuing. It's in sample form right now. Let's see here. Gonna change. Okay. So this is what they're planning on issuing, right? So you're gonna have to essentially report the type of transaction, hosted, unhosted, wallet, no wallet, number of units. I mean, they have so many entries on this form, gain or loss, short term or long term. In my opinion, it's going to create an administrative nightmare for those that have cryptos and are reporting as they should with the current rules. And then the crypto exchanges are going to be ridiculous, right? I mean, they're going to have an administrative compliance it's going to be way too much for the system to handle, in my opinion. So right now, this is what it looks like. So you have your address, your account number, your QSIP, and imagine if you have. I don't know about you, but there are people that have different that work with different crypto exchanges, right? Whether it's Coinbase, or I mean, there's a bunch of other ones. Coinbase is kind of the main one, but there's also crypto wallets that are hard wallets, right? That you keep on a thumb drive or anything like that. So, like, how are they wanting those things to be reported? It's just beyond me that they're creating this process now to kind of just meddle into what you're doing in terms of crypto. So crypto is going to be an interesting topic, especially with the advent of AI. I'll probably cover it more as I learn more about it and I learn the potential uses for crypto. I have some ideas in my head, um, but that's kind of where we're at, right? So um, it's still in draft form. We're going to be looking at it here as we progress to see what they're going to do with this. But again, it just seems a little bit much if you have multiple exchanges and you're pretty much in the crypto space. It just seems a little bit much to me. We'll see what happens. Um, but I did want to make you aware that this form is coming out, um, and that you will have to, essentially report the information that's on it on your taxes, so that they can tax either the gain on the crypto or they can tax the interest, the cash, whatever it is that you're getting on the exchanges. Um, that's just kind of what they're attempting to do right now. Okay, now I want to go over another topic. First thing I want to do is I want to show you a video. Give me a second here. This is from one of Trump's rallies. Um, Kind of um, interesting topic to kind of go over here. So let's take a look at what's
happening. This is the first time I've said this, and for those hotel workers and people that get tips, you're going to be very happy, because when I get to office, we are going to not charge taxes on tips, people making tips. We're not going to do it, and we're going to do that right away, first thing in office, because it's been a point of contention for years and years and years, and you do a great job of service, you take care of people, and I think it's going to be something that really is deserved. More importantly, popular or unpopular. I do some unpopular things, too, if it's right for the country. I do what's right. But so those people that have jobs in restaurants, whatever the job may be, a tipping job, we're not going after for taxes anymore. This will be ended. And I announced that for the first time I've brought it up. First time anyone's brought it up. I think it's never been brought up before, and I also think it's very appropriate.
Redefine web.
So that is actually an interesting concept that I want to explore a little more, to get an idea of what the implications of that is, right? So I went ahead and did a sample tax return. I played around with ChatGPT and I did that. But let's kind of explore what the world of tipping looks like, and the taxes associated with tipping, right? So this publication here, this is just the general instructions for their W-2s. And so when you receive, let's say you work at a restaurant, right? When you receive tips, you either receive the tips because as a whole, the customer tipped the establishment and the establishment allocated the tip to you based on whatever agreement you have with them, whether you're at the bar or you're retail or a server, or the people at the table actually leave cash tips on your table, and then you take that right with you. So there are so many rules associated with tips, and I can see why he's even brought this up, because it's so complicated and there's so many gotchas. it's impossible for someone who's in the tipping, like in the service industry, like receives tips, to keep track of every single minutia that happens throughout their day. It's impossible, right? So the fact that they're even floating this to me is a good idea. Just because again, it lessens the reporting burden, the compliance burden on those people that may not be making, you know, a lot of money on tips. Well, now they don't have to worry about it, right? So we're going to go over the basic publications associated with tipping. So um, publication 531. So that's the one that kind of goes over tipping. They revised it. This one's 1244 is um, no longer valid. So they went with 531. And as you can see, I'm going to just scroll down so you can see everything associated with tipping. This is what the person has to do in order to comply with all the tipping. And this is just a part of it, right? So this is everything the person has to do to comply with tips and the regulations regarding tips. So basically, there's a daily record keeping requirement, right? You must keep daily tip records so you can report your tips accurately to your employer. Well, before we even do that, let's go over the W-2 because this is where everything gets reported on, right? As far as tips. Let me pull up a generic W-2 here. Give me a second. Unless it's on here. Let's see. No, I didn't print the W-2. Okay. Let me pull up a W-2. Okay. So this is the current version of the W-2, right? So as you can see, there is right here. So you have box 7 and box 8, right? So basically what happens is when you receive tips, it's either going to come in as wages, straight wages from your employer, social security tips, or allocated tips from from your employer, right? So your employer receives a tip and then they allocate the rest to you. So right now, these are the three areas where you'll see tips. As far as publication 531, we're just going to briefly go over, we're not going to go over everything. We're going to briefly go over it so we understand what's happening with tips and the daily requirements that are put on some of these servers, which I think it's a load of crap, right? To speak frankly. So now here, reporting your tips accurately to your employer, report your tips accurately on your tax return, and prove your tip income if your return is ever questioned, right? So now the burden of proof on tips is on the actual server. So it just baffles me that the IRS is actually doing this in terms of the reporting requirements. Like it almost feels like these people have to have like a PhD in accounting and the GAAP rules and how it all works just to actually comply with their tip requirement, right? So we're gonna actually move this over here. Okay. All right, so how to keep a daily tip. There are two ways to keep daily tips. You can either write information about your tips in a tip diary or keep copies of documents that shows your tips, such as restaurant bills, credit, debit, card charges, and slips, etc. So either A, I don't know how many, I mean, I've never been in this in I've never been a server, but I would imagine that that server on any given shift sees a lot of people, depending on the establishment, right? 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 people a day. So now what you're having to do is in the middle, in between your shifts, you're gonna have to keep a diary of the tips that you receive, or you have to just put the receipts in your pocket and then spend hours and hours allocating all that stuff on the back end. Like it's just it makes this whole area makes no sense to me at all in the tax code. All right, so let's keep reading here. You should keep your daily tip record with your taxes and personal records. You must keep your records for as long as they are important administrative federal law, which is normally 4 years. You're gonna have to have 4 years of stuff um, just ready to go in case the IRS asks. I mean, come on. Start your records by writing your name, your employer name, the name of the business. If it's different from your employer, then each workday. Da, da, da. Cash tips you get directly from customers. This is what you have to write down on your diary every day, right? Cash tips you get directly from customers or from other employees. Tips from credit and debit customers that employer pays you. The value of non-cash tips you get, such as tickets, passes, or other items. The amount of tips you paid out to other employees throughout tip pools. So I know some restaurants they'll like allocate percentages. So the bartender will get X, the server will get S, the host will get X, the person that cleans up will get X. So you have to make sure you allocate all that. You know what I mean, and uh, be ready to report on that if the IRS asks. You can use an electronic tip record system, daily tips. You do not have percent. Okay, service charges. Don't write in your tip diary the amount of any service charge that your employer adds to a customer's bill, then pays to you as treats as wages. This is part of your wages, not a tip. The following factors determine. Again, it just there's so many idiosyncrasies with this publication that I can see where the presidential candidate Trump is saying, "Hey, the first thing we're going to do is scrap all this, right?" And it's just going to simplify the life of everybody in this service industry. Now, I'm not saying, "Hey, no taxes on tips, zero taxes on tips," because there's always it's all about balance, right? You can't have extremes because then what will happen is, oh, no taxes on tips. Okay, well now everybody's going to make $200,000-300,000 in tips, and that just doesn't that doesn't help anybody. So, but there should be like there should be some left and right limits. I'm not entirely sure. I haven't thought out what that looks like, but this is not the answer, right? There's too much record keeping, too much administrative crap that you have to deal with. Just like the 1099 DA is not an answer. Just like the 1099K, that's supposed to they're supposed to change that process to account for everyone who makes under $600. And we haven't talked about that, but we will at a future video. It's just too much of an administrative burden for people, and not just people, employers, organizations that actually have to report all this stuff, exchanges, right? And the funny thing is about just how the IRS and actually state agencies work is if you don't report this, like let's say you don't make any tips and you don't report this or whatever, right? Or you made small amount of tips, or hey, they find out through an employer, blah blah blah. Well, now you're on the hook for penalties and interest. So that's how normally these things work. It's to me, it's just well, look at this here. You can avoid the penalty for not reporting tips to your employer. So we're gonna go over that essentially, so you can see what all this is all about, right? So okay, so report your employer's cash. If your total tips for any month from any one job are less than 20, don't report for that month, right? So this threshold has to be increased significantly or just done away with completely. Like there has to be so that way the administrative burden isn't on the actual person working, right? It should be on the government agency that that is trying to get all this stuff. Like that's where most of the work should go. Um, but again, the burden of proof is on you to keep a daily log in the event of. So that's just kind of the way that works. And when he brought it up, I was like, oh, that's very interesting. And it might actually stimulate the economy to build more establishments, restaurant establishments, because people will be more likely to be like, hey, you know what? Well, I'm making tips here. I don't have to report this much in income. So now instead of making $15 an hour, you can make 15 in tips, right? And it just works out. I think it works out for everyone. I still have to kind of explore it a little more, but on the surface, to me, this is a great idea. Let's see. If you participate in tipping in a pool arrangement, report only the tips you received and retained. Do not report to your employer any portion of the tips you receive that you pass on to employees. However, you must report tips you receive from other employees. All right. Don't report the value of non-cash tips such as tickets. Da, 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 da. Okay. How to report. So now you have your name, address, the month in which you received the tips, and then the total tips. That's what you have to put on your log. You must sign and date the statement. Keep a copy with your tax records, personal records. Okay. Your employer may require you to report your tips more than once a month. However, the statement can't cover a period of more than one calendar month, right? Okay, when to report. Give your report for each month to your employer by the 10th of the next month. If the 10th falls on a Saturday or Sunday or legal holiday, give your employer the report by next day that isn't Saturday or Sunday. Legal holidays can fall on, okay, example. And then you go through an example. Um, again, this just seems like too much. So the fact that he brought this up, man, I think it's a good thing again. Um, okay, so penalty for not reporting. Penalty for not reporting tips. If you don't report tips to your employer as required, you may be subject to a penalty equal to 50% of the Social Security, Medicare, additional Medicare tax, or railroad retirement tax you owe on the unreported tips. 50%. And we're going to go over a sample return so we can see what that 50% possibly, could be. Yeah, it's beyond ridiculous. The penalty amount is in addition to the taxes you owe. You can avoid this penalty if you can show reasonable cause for not reporting the tips to your employers. To do so, attach a statement that you didn't report them. Giving your employer money for taxes. Again, like who is going to sit there and go through all this in the service industry? Like you actually have to go to work. And then if you have a family, let's assume you have kids and now you have to be at the house and doing things at the house with the kids. There's just not enough time in the day to actually read through this and make sure you set the proper procedures to comply with every single sentence in this publication. So the fact that he brought it up again, I'm going to say this a million times. It's a great idea. Okay, so 50% on the taxes, right? Uncollected tax, you must report. No. Okay, let's see what else. Okay. A 0.9% additional Medicare tax applies to Medicare wages, RRTA complex railroad compensation, and self-employment income that are more than 125 and married separately, 250, and then 200 if any other filing status. So there's going to be additional a 0.9% additional Medicare tax on the wages you make above 125. So just keep that in mind. Tip rate determination and education program. Your employer may participate in the tip rate education and tip rate determination and education program. The program was developed to help employees and employers understand and meet their tipping reporting requirements. There are two agreements under the program: the tip rate determination and the tip rate. So more programs, right? If you are employed in the gaming industry, your employer may participate in the gaming industry. So there's three programs now that we're looking at. And these are all the revenue procedures that come with those programs. So for every, there's a revenue bulletin, and in those revenue bulletins, there are procedures that they change, modify, and then that doesn't have to pass through Congress or anything. That's just something the IRS does. Okay, here's a new law, and this is what we're doing. And then, okay, reporting tips on your tax return. How to report tips on your tax return, right? So on the 1040, what tips to report? Generally, you must report all your tips received in the tax year on your tax return, including both cash tips and non-cash tips. Remember, tickets, they all consider that, income and tips and stuff like that. So any tips you reported to your employer as required on the tax year are included in wages and income. So if you report it to the employer, it's going to be included in wages and income. And then only the tips that you didn't report are included in the allocated tips. So, and we'll go over that and what all that means. So, however, you do include in box one any tips received in December of the tax year that were timely reported in January of the following year. So now you're having to do journal entries on your daily blog, on your daily thing to report your tips for December, right? That's actually really interesting. Okay, so example, you began on June 30th. Okay, so they go over an example. Reporting to Social Security, Medicare, and Railroad tax on tips not reported to employer. If you receive $20 or more in cash and charge tips in a month from any job and didn't report all those tips to your employer, you must report Social Security, Medicare, additional to report these. You must file a 1040. Okay, so you must file a 1040 or form even if you won't otherwise have to file. So this is key here, right? Even if you don't have to file a tax return and you make tips in cash, you have to report these tips to the IRS via your 1040. So you have to now pay a tax preparer like myself, or I mean, if you can get it for free, which is not going to happen because you're going to have to file the SE form. You have to pay a software company, H&R Block, TurboTax, TaxAct, TaxLayer, one of those to file your taxes when it comes to it. Okay, so reporting uncollected Social Security, Medicare, you may have uncollected taxes if regular pay. Okay, if your employer could not collect all the Social Security, Medicare, or railroad retirement tax you owe on tips reported, the uncollected tax will be shown on box 12. Okay, yeah, that's allocated tips. Here we go. If your employer allocated tips to you, they're shown separately in box 8. So this is box 8 of the W-2, right? And I know I just had it up. The W-2, where did you go? Here we go. So that's box 8, right? Right there. So if your employer allocated tips to you, they're shown separately on box 8 of W-2. They're not included in box 1. If box 8 is blank, this discussion doesn't apply. But if it's not, these are tips that your employer allocated to you in addition to the tips you reported. Your work in an establishment, restaurant, cocktail lounge, or similar business that must allocate tips to your employees. The tips you reported to your employer were less than your share of 8% of food and drinks and sales. No income, Social Security, Medicare, or railroad retirement tax are withheld for allocated tips. So that means that money, you have to actually pay taxes on that money yourself, right? And let's see here. Give me 1 second. Yeah. So I'm going to show you what happens on the sample tax return so you can see how this affects your overall taxes at the end of the year, right? All right, so you must report. Where were we? How were you report figures? The tips allocated to you are your share of an amount figured by the subtracting the reported tips of all employees from 8% or an approved lower rate, which you have to get permission to get a lower rate of food, drink sales, etc. Your share of that amount was figured using either a method provided by an employer-employer agreement. So now you have to have an agreement in place between each employee and employer, um, and then the sales hours worked. So again, yeah, this just becomes so complicated that it's almost impossible to follow to the T. Um, so I'm glad that they brought it up. Okay, how to report this allocated income if you received any tips in a tax year that you didn't report your to your employer as required. Add these tips to box one, box two, W2, da da da, because Social Security, Medicare, okay, complete 4137 and include the allocated tips on that form. And then you go through, you have to file a petition with the IRS to request a lower amount. They're going to take 6 months to a year to process it. Um, and yeah, so employees filing the petition must promptly notify the employer, and the employer must promptly give the IRS a copy of all forms 8027, employer annual return reports filed in the establishment for the previous 3 years. Yeah. Okay. So how to get tax help? Again, visit irs.gov for tax help. They have free file programs available. They have a VITA program that's available, but they have TCE, they have meal tax. There's a lot of programs. Some of them are hit or miss depending on the actual person that's actually doing it. Some of them just have a PTIN, which is the preparer tax identification number, but they don't really have any kind of education behind it. So I mean, it is what it is. They're good programs just to get some basic information, but this is not going to be basic, right? So you're likely are going to have to pay. So that's why I'm glad that they're even bringing up the fact that they're going to get rid of all this. Then they have social media, they have standard print. You can get a transcript. You can make a payment on these. Okay, so a lot of this stuff is just administrative stuff. So now let's go ahead and look at a sample tax return. So what I did was I said, okay, let me go into sample tax return here, right? And then see what it would look like for somebody who reported 20,000 in tips, 20,000 in wages, 20,000 social security tips, 20,000 wages, and then 20,000 in allocated tips. And so we went through, we put it into the software. And let me see if I make this bigger here so we can all see it. So 40,000, that's for this. 26,000 is the taxable income. The tax on that is 2,921, but because of the allocated tips, there's an additional tax of 1,530, right? So your balance due for taxes, if you're a server at the end of the year, is going to be $4,451, right? And again, this is based on 2023's current rates, assuming there's not going to be any changes in 2024. This is kind of where you'll land. So that's pretty much, and then that the form, the additional taxes here. So total additional taxes for Social Security and Medicare for the unallocated tips. That's where that comes from. And then if you go down, you'll see this form that they're requiring you to file, right? So this is the employer, that's the amount, and then this is the total cash that you received in tips. So you have to put that in there. Okay, so that's a tax return. So now let's go into the software. So I use my tax prep to actually prepare tax returns, which again I'm kind of slowing down on so I can build a software to make it easier. But this is what happens, right? So you have your tax bill here. If you add an additional, let's say you got an additional 10,000 in cash tips that you didn't report, doubles. I mean, it doesn't double, but it goes up by 50%, basically, your bill, right? So if you go here, keep this at 20, and then you go this to 30, it goes a little bit down, right? Because you're not having to pay essentially self-employment tax. And then if this goes up, right? So, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, so that's the Social Security. That's just the bill that's going to happen on Social Security. So it's like you're penalized for getting cash tips at the end of the day. So it's almost better to just what they want you to do is report all this stuff and go through the administrative quagmire, um, to report all this, as opposed to, which is, if you ask me, that's why they're bringing up the 1099 DA as well. Um, so that's what's happening um, with the tax tips. Hopefully, once Trump gets in office, they get rid of all that crap, and hopefully they really, really reduce the burden on these people that are, serving, and just make things simpler, and maybe start with this and then bring it all across the IRS, right? Just get rid of a lot of these compliance things that cost money for people that don't necessarily have the ends, especially now people are getting laid off, left and right. AI is coming. I haven't even talked about that. Eventually I will, but um, yeah, so eventually, hopefully, and eventually they get rid of all this, and then everything's good to go. So this is what I wanted to bring up for today. For the next, I'm working on some other topics for the next one, including some presidential stuff, since election is coming up. Analyzing some presidential tax returns, and just stay in touch for that. I'm going to eventually put that out. Um, and then I'm also going to work on an update for the 1099K to see where that's at. Last I heard, they were going to delay it. Um, well, they delayed it for 2023. It's supposed to implement in 2024. Hopefully, it never goes through. But we'll see what happens with that. As always, stay tuned for news. Hit me up if you have any questions. I'll be here. And then, yeah, I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.